In our literary nonfiction workshop, we will study several subgenres of the larger genre of literary nonfiction. We'll begin by studying memoir, we'll move from there to the family portrait, and thereafter we'll look at other subgenres such as nature writing, travel writing, the lyric essay, and so on. I assigned Annie Dillard's exquisite little essay, Living Like Weasels, for our first day of class, just to show you what a brilliant literary nonfiction writer can do. How she can take something very ordinary, like a weasel, and in just a handful of sentences, defamiliarize that familiarity in such a way that we were shocked into seeing the weasel freshly. And in some ways, we might say that that's what literary language in any genre does. It moves back and forth between the familiar and the unfamiliar. In many cases, literary language will describe something very familiar, but through literary technique, make it feel unfamiliar in such a way that we are invited to see this thing freshly. But it can go the other way too. The writer can sometimes start with something very unfamiliar, bizarre, outre, outlandish, but describe it in such a way as it becomes accessible or knowable. Percy Bysshe Shelley, in his essay Defense of Poetry, said that's exactly what poetry does. It rips away the veil of familiarity from the world and makes it feel fresh. Well, I think that's what Dillard's doing here. I'm simply going to look at the very first paragraph. You might want to take out your text and follow along. It's in the Touchstone Anthology. It's on page 148. And if you could just take that out and follow along with me, this little talk will be much clearer for you. Here's what Dillard says. A weasel is wild. Who knows what he thinks? He sleeps in his underground den, his tail draped over his nose. Sometimes he lives in his den for 2 days without leaving. Outside he stalks rabbits, mice, muskrats, and birds, killing more bodies than he can eat warm, and often dragging the carcasses home. Obedient to instinct, he bites his prey at the neck, either splitting the jugular vein at the throat or crunching the brain at the base of the skull, and he does not let go. One naturalist refused to kill a weasel who was socketed into his hand deeply as a rattlesnake. The man could in no way pry the tiny weasel off, and he had to walk half a mile in water, the weasel dangling from his palm, and soak him off like a stubborn label. So what is the weasel? The weasel has an immediate force driven by instinct, tenacious instinct, direct tenacious instinct, to the point where it will latch on to someone's hand and simply will not let go. Dillard's prose here has that kind of directness, that kind of power. The sentence style the syntax is quite simple throughout. Lots of subject verb, object, subject verb nominative, very direct, forward moving prose. But at the same time, she brings forth very striking imagery. It's almost like the imagery itself bites, like a weasel itself might bite. A weasel is wild. Just that opening alone, it's almost like a lunge forward. Not only the shortness of the sentence, but notice how she uses alliteration. The weasel is wild. That those W's give the kind of force and punch to the sentence. But notice that we don't have extremely strong consonants like T's or B's, which would give even more punch. We have W's, which are kind of in between, like S's and T's. So there's a sense that there's a punch of the alliteration, but it's not a full-on punch. Just as the weasel itself is so quick and elusive. Did Dillard sit down and choose to do that deliberately? Probably not, but that's what is in the sentence. Who knows what he thinks? This is a question that cannot be answered. So already there's a sense that there's mystery here, not clarity. And then she goes on just to give pictures of him, but the pictures aren't necessarily connected in a logical way. They're just like quick snapshots, almost a montage effect. of the weasel. We see him sleeping in his den. We see him sleeping for 2 days. Then we get to see him stalking all these different other kinds of animals. And we get to see him behave based on instinct. And what does he do? Bites the prey at the neck, or he crunches the brain at the base of the skull and does not let go. There's a power and there's a force, and these quick biting images capture the power and the force of the weasel. But then notice this last image. It's breathtaking to me. How after describing the great power and strangeness of this weasel, she says that the naturalist who has the weasel latched onto his hand puts the weasel down into water, and only then will he let go. And the weasel soaks off like a stubborn label, a label that you might have on a jelly jar, and you soak it in water and the label slides off. If we look closely at the analogy, that would mean that the weasel itself, this powerful, strange little beast, is no more significant than the paper on a jar of jelly. Why does Dillard do this? Clearly she thinks that the weasel is something much more interesting than a piece of paper soaking off, say, a jar of jelly. I think what she's doing here is that she herself is saying that, look, my prose style is not safe. You don't know what I'm going to do next. Just when you think you're onto me, I'm going to dart another way. I am as mysterious and enigmatic in my writing as a weasel is in his behavior. So this paragraph is a perfect example of what great literary language does. It is what it is about. It is what it is about. It simply doesn't describe a weasel, but through Dillard's techniques, in a way, the words themselves behave like a weasel. They are a weasel.